The 1980s were a great decade to read comic books, especially the second half. And in the second half of the 1980s, Batman had a rebirth of sorts. And it was an older story of Batman coming out of retirement that would be a catalyst for a number of great Batman stories that were to come later in the 1980s. I had previously made a video about the best DC comic books to read in the 1980s, and I intentionally left Batman out just because, there are so many quality Batman stories that it would have just dominated that list. Okay, let's take a look at some of these stories that would reshape Batman and relaunch him as one of the greatest comic book characters of all time. In 1986, DC published a landmark 4-issue series by Frank Miller called The Dark Knight Returns. This is a trade paperback that collects all 4 issues from that series, and I cannot understate the importance of this series would have for Batman. Now, for an extended period of time, Batman was just not a very good seller for DC. If you take a look at this top 100 list published by Capital, a comic book distributor, you would see that Batman and Detective Comics placed at number 67 and number 68. I mean, this is behind titles like Power Man and Iron Fist and Gem, Son of Saturn. When Batman The Dark Knight Returns was solicited to comic book retailers, I think a lot of them were kind of hesitant. One of the reasons why is because Frank Miller came to DC and published this 6-issue series called Ronin. And it was also printed on this kind of deluxe format. And while it was a critical success, I think for comic book retailers, it wasn't a great seller. So here you have another kind of set of expensive books. Even though it's Batman, Batman was not by any means a great seller. Even though Frank Miller was attached to it, they were probably a little conservative in terms of how they would order. This time around, though, Frank Miller hit it out of the park. It was an instant success, and actually the first issue had multiple printings. The Dark Knight Returns brought Batman back into the forefront, a very gritty, violent, angry Batman. These Batman comics weren't for kids anymore. And all of a sudden, Batman was relevant again. Batman was cool. I don't want to discount the other 2 contributors of this series, and that's Klaus Janson and Lynn Varley. They brought a polish that was more familiar with comic book fans to this series that might have been missing with Ronin. The square-bound prestige format for this series was also perfect. The high production values of this series give it far more weight and would be a huge influence on future projects for many comic book publishers at that time. If you've been a long-time comic book fan, you know how important this series is and how great the story is and the impact it had for Batman. If you haven't read it, you're in for a treat. To me, this series would be in my top 10 of all time. Without a doubt, probably in my top 3. It really had that much of an impact for me as a comic book fan, and honestly, it kind of overloaded my brain at that time. Batman 400 was a special anniversary issue that had a multitude of contributors work on the story. A special story featuring one of Batman's greatest foes, Ra's al Ghul. Take a look at the A-list of creators who worked on this book. DC had done similar treatment to Superman with his 400th issue. I actually remember reading this, and it had kind of a jarring effect on me because the art changed every few pages. But this issue gives you a great perspective on all the talent that worked on Batman over the years. It also gives you a brief look at Batman's extensive rogues gallery. There was a lot I didn't know about Batman at this time, and this issue does a nice job of getting you up to speed. Batman 400? Check it out. It's hard to imagine Frank Miller topping Dark Knight Returns, but, he almost did, or in some people's opinion did, with Batman Year One. Batman Year One started with issue Batman 404 and lasted 4 issues. And what's also interesting about this series is that not only did it provide like a really gritty, darker kind of origin story of Batman, but a lot of the story was also focused on James Gordon, the future commissioner of Gotham City at that time. Commissioner Gordon is often kind of a secondary character in a lot of Batman comic books, but in this case, he's not. And having this kind of additional information about, Commissioner Gordon was really good and really integral to the story. David Mazzucchelli's artwork is perfect for this series, and it blows my mind as well that this duo also produced Daredevil's Born Again series just a year before. If you're a Batman fan, this is a must-read. It's available in trade paperback form, and it's been reprinted several times, so it should be easy to find anywhere. I'm not going to go into too many details for a lot of these stories because I really want you as a comic book reader to discover the stories yourself. What I remember specifically about Son of the Demon was that it came out in hardcover, and this was kind of unusual for that time because, Marvel and DC really didn't publish hardcover editions of their comic books. But I think with the popularity of Batman going on the rise, I think they started, hey, let's push out these more expensive comic book formats and see how comic book fans, react. To me, Son of the Demon is kind of like a throwback to the 1970s Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams Batman. And it also features Ra's al Ghul and Talia, who are also like primary characters at that time. The story does revolve around Ra's al Ghul, Talia, and Batman. As well, it also has kind of an interesting open ending as well. To capitalize on Batman's increasing popularity, DC really started to push out a lot more Batman content. But typically, when publishers push out a lot of content on a specific character, chances are not all of it's going to be very good. But in this case, you had a lot of really good quality Batman content come out in a really short period of time. The first story arc I want to talk about is Batman 10 Nights of the Beast, which started with Batman number 417. And this was written by Jim Starlin. And I also want to say that this was the year of Jim Starlin's Batman. Frank Miller gets a lot of, attention and recognition for what he did with Batman. But in my opinion, one writer who doesn't get enough credit is actually Jim Starlin. And in 1988, Jim Starlin was the Batman writer. And the first story is 10 Nights of the Beast. So 10 Nights of the Beast came out in March 1988, and it was done by Jim Starlin and Jim Aparo. And Frank Miller's work on Batman was big, but if there's one writer who doesn't get enough attention for Batman, it's Jim Starlin. Now, I'm a big fan of Jim Starlin, and there's, probably some bias here, and Jim Starlin is, probably better known for Thanos and the Infinity Gauntlet. But really, the impact Jim Starlin had on Batman in 1988 was just huge. 10 Nights of the Beast is a 4-part series that ran in Batman. It's a rather ruthless story about a Soviet agent called the KG Beast running havoc in Gotham and killing a lot of notable political figures to create chaos. He pushes Batman to the brink in this series and is a very memorable villain. This series is also notable for the striking covers of Mike Zeck. If I can just talk a little bit about Mike Zeck, to me, he is one of the premier cover artists of the 1980s. I mean, if you look at some of the stuff he did, like Captain America, The Punisher, even Spider-Man, it's really amazing the covers that Mike Zeck did in this period of time. The Killing Joke came out in July 1988, and this is the definitive Batman Joker story. Frank Miller's portrayal of the Joker was very notable in The Dark Knight Returns, but Alan Moore and Brian Boland's rendition is richer, filling in a lot of his origin and history. What's interesting to note this year as well is that it also feels that artists and writers were really starting to push a lot of boundaries. Alan Moore was producing some astonishing work at an astonishing rate at this time. He just wrapped up his work in Swamp Thing, as well as Watchmen, and at this time I think he was also working on V for Vendetta. Some of these are considered to be some of the best comic books of all time. If you haven't read it, try picking up like a hardcover version like this. It's a little bit larger than the original version, and it also has additional information, sketches about the comic book itself. Cannot highly recommend this enough. I mentioned Jim Starlin, and in 1988 he would also team up with Bernie Wrightson to produce a memorable 4-issue series called Batman the Cult. Now, they had teamed up before and, produced a series called The Weird, and I actually, liked the series a lot and mentioned it in my other DC recommended reading for the 1980s. Batman the Cult is a 4-issue series produced in prestige format, and it would actually be one of the best-selling DC titles for 1988. It's interesting to note in the forward of this trade paperback, Jim Starlin goes on to, some detail with regards to the reemergence of censorship in comic books and other, forms of media at that time. And this was kind of his, in some ways a response to it. And, no doubt it's a violent series, but to me as well, it seems like just Jim and Bernie were just having a lot of fun writing this really good Batman story. There are a few notable splash pages by Wrightson that just stand out and are so memorable to me. What's also interesting about the first issue of this series is that the cover is embossed. First time that I think this was ever done in comic books. I could be wrong, but I just thought it was kind of interesting that they kind of chose this effect for this prestige format book at that time. 1988 really feels like the year of Batman. In 1988, Batman actually even was featured in the Entertainment Evening News with a really huge event. And, that kind of stuff doesn't really happen very often in comic books. Coming out around the same time as Batman the Cult would be the 4-issue story arc featured in Batman called A Death in the Family. This 4-issue series caused a lot of buzz. And so much so that, it was even featured in the Entertainment Nightly News at times. And the reason was because the finale of this series was to be determined by comic book readers and fans. There was actually some kind of telephone vote where you can vote in to say if you want Robin to live or Robin to die. And surprisingly, well, I was surprised, they actually chose Robin to die. And, in some ways I kind of get it because, comic book fans, comic book readers like drama. And there's nothing more dramatic than the death of a significant comic book character. Now, as you may well know, no comic book character really ever dies in comic books. They come back in one form or another, and Jason Todd is no exception. But certainly for that time, this series created a lot of buzz. And hey, this is another, story arc written by Jim Starlin in 1988. In March 1989, Detective Comics ran a 3-issue story arc called Blind Justice, and that was written by Sam Hamm. Now, you may know Sam Hamm was actually one of the kind of preliminary scriptwriters for the Batman movie that came out just a little bit later. And it's really too bad that, Sam didn't go on to write more comic books because, obviously he's a very capable writer. And this really shows in this 3-issue story arc. What's kind of interesting about this kind of 3-issue story arc is that it focuses a lot more on Bruce Wayne, not so much on Batman and some of the other things that he's got to deal with. I don't want to say any more, but it's a pretty long read, close to 150 pages, and it still holds up quite well. But check it out. Blind Justice, Detective Comics, 598 to number 600. As I just mentioned, in 1989, the Batman movie was released. And, in comic books, the popularity of Batman, the trajectory was certainly going up. But then it just exploded with the movie. And the success of the movie really spilled over into the comic book stores. If you were a comic book retailer at that time, you were doing very well. Not only did it bring people into comic book stores, but comic book collectors also kind of jumped on the bandwagon 100%, yours truly included. And, DC really took advantage of this, and later in that year they would publish Batman, The Legends of the Dark Knight, and this would be Batman's first solo title, I think in 40 years at that time, and it was also written by Grant Morrison. Grant Morrison would also write Arkham Asylum, which was another hardcover Batman story that came out that year. Now, they're good stories, but to me, they're not as memorable as the other Batman stories of that time period. Actually, what is more memorable for me about Batman, The Legends of the Dark Knight is this, the silly 4 variant covers of the first issue. And this was going to be the start of a bad trend for comic book publishers where they would start to gouge comic book speculators and readers and collectors like myself. Because, why not squeeze more money out of these collectors if they're willing to pay? The last Batman book I want to talk about is Gotham by Gaslight, and this came out in the tail end of 1989. It's written by Brian Augustyn and drawn by Mike Mignola. And the story revolves around a 19th century version of Bruce Wayne making his debut as Batman just as Jack the Ripper arrives in Gotham City. This story is also notable because it's the first Elseworlds story by DC. Well, at that time, it wasn't recognized as that, but, now they recognize Gotham by Gaslight as the first Elseworlds story. So what this means is this kind of story takes place out of the continuity of the normal DC universe, either through time, different world, or whatever. So it's not part of DC canon. But it's a wonderful read, a single story, and you can really see Mike Mignola's artwork come into form, certainly looking a lot like what his Hellboy stuff would look like in the future. So highly recommended, Gotham by Gaslight. So there you have it. In my opinion, probably the greatest period of Batman comic books ever made. If you enjoyed this video, you might want to check out my other 1980s DC recommended reading list. There's a lot of great stuff in that video that I highly recommend that's worth checking out. Until next time, read and enjoy your comic books.